Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. For our final session of the day, discussing our latest special exhibition, Fighting for the Right to Fight, African American Experiences in World War II, it is my pleasure to introduce a dear friend of the museums, of my own and of many of yours, Dr. John Morrow. John had to skip out last year at the conference, and we missed him, but we're delighted that he's back with us. He is a presidential counselor to the museum and a past convener of that important body, former chair of the conference planning committee. For his paying gig, he was a longtime professor at the University of Georgia, retired recently, and so now he's professor emeritus, author or co-author of 8 publications, and an all-around good guy. John has also been involved in this exhibition in its first iteration, which he will talk about, and now he's been a special advisor in this new iteration that you all will have the opportunity to see tonight at the open house. John, it's great to have you back. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome him back.
Those are the kindest words anyone has said to me today, Jeremy. I was being harassed in the back by Con Crane and using me, innocent that I am, to threaten Krewasky over there. And I'm thinking, these Army guys, these former colonels all stick together and gang up on a civilian historian, but it is a pleasure and an honor to be back. I had to miss one of the sessions I was scheduled to appear upon when I made the mistake of going to the Pritzker celebration. I was awarded a Pritzker Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing in 2019. Thank you. I'm very proud of that, and somehow I managed, although I retired in 2022, to be awarded the Society for Military History's Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize this past year. I signaled that to thank you again, and I took that as the end of my writing career. So I'm living happily now. My wife says, you need to do something to occupy yourself. And I look at her and say, I think I'll harass you. This is now the time for it. But I missed one of the earlier ones because I went up there to Chicago and caught a disease, strep throat, which, you can catch COVID, but strep throat. And so I had to call the museum and speak to Jeremy and say, I can't come because I can't talk. Now I can talk again. So let's get going today. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to introduce our panel of experts, one person short, for the museum's new exhibit, Fighting for the Right to Fight, African American Experiences in World War II. Now I have to change this a little. This afternoon we have a panel of one historian who served as exhibit advisor, and that's obviously me, Dr. John Morrow, Franklin Professor Emeritus of the History of War and Society at the University of Georgia in Athens, and 2 curators, or historians, who transform their knowledge and thoughts and advice of the advisors into a riveting exhibit. So they are really the key. We outside historians feel privileged to serve with them because, and it's been my experience having done several of these, I am always amazed at how they transform our thoughts into the reality of an exhibit. Cory Graff, sitting to my left, the museum's internal curator, and I'm going to blow his cover immediately, a graduate of the University of Oregon, which for those of you who watch football, and that better be everyone, Oregon is the #1 team in the country right now. Because we at the University of Georgia admit that our quarterback took 3 weeks off, probably driving his Lamborghini that he got on NIL. A stupid invention. He's back now. He has returned. His head is in the game. Now we're trying to figure out how we get to the championship game without playing anyone. We'll see how that works out. Oregon may well be the champion. He is a curator, more importantly for our purposes, of 28 years' experience, starting with the Museum of Flight in Seattle, where he helped lead the development of, and this is really critical for me, of their World War I gallery. Then, because it was aviation, I was invited out there to speak. And so I realized when I looked at his vita, and we had met before in an earlier life, because I'd written a number of books on World War I aviation. And so it's a pleasure to be back with him here. He's come here by way of the Museum of Flight, and then the Flying Heritage and Combat Armor Museum, and now, of course, here. And he has written 10 books primarily on World War II aviation. So it is best to keep us separate, because with my knowledge of World War I aviation, his knowledge of World War II aviation, we could talk for years on that subject, and we won't. Now, Dr. Krewasky Salter, further to my left, who is a product of 2 Florida institutions, the University of Florida and Florida State, former football powers, is a retired U.S. Army colonel with 25 years of active service, duty including a tour at the Pentagon. He is further a published military historian, museum curator, and military museum executive. He has taught military history and strategy at such prestigious institutions, the United States Military Academy at West Point and the Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth. He served as executive director of the 1st Division Museum, which is at Cantigny, named after the battle in World War I, and president of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, which is in the process of moving from Chicago, or probably has moved to Kenosha, Wisconsin. In fact, I know Dr. Salter from an earlier exhibit. He was the curator of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Cultures exhibit on World War I in Washington as we returned home fighting, for which I served as the lead outside historian, advisor. So I have past history of both of these gentlemen. I had planned at this point to sit down because I would have introduced the 3rd person, who is another historical advisor, but she's not here, and I cannot do her. So I will say something about what it's like to do one of these exhibits, and then really turn it over to the experts. The first exhibit I did was years ago in the late 80s at the Smithsonian National Museum of Aviation in Washington when they did their World War I exhibit for the first time. For years it had just been 4 small biplane fighters and some pictures. Well, we reformulated it and did it as both an aviation, but an aviation industry development before and during World War I. Then I was privileged to serve in the first iteration of the current exhibit that's premiering there, which was over 10 years ago, much smaller committee, fewer funds, but we did, and I give the museum credit for expert curator, and we had outside advisors. And when I saw the museum's creation, I was shocked. These are collaborative ventures. You have people putting their heads together from diverse experiences and with a knowledge of history. And you might be a historical advisor and you will have talked with them and they will have shown you what they're doing in a small setup. But the first time you go see that, you're shocked. And you think, oh my God, they realized this. They were able to do that in a way I could never have envisaged. So the first one we did, the most fascinating part of it was the curator set out to get the 7 medals of honor that African Americans had been awarded in the Second World War. I got a call one day from him. He said, I've got 6. I'm having trouble getting the 7th. And I thought, okay, keep me posted. I can't do anything. About a week later, I've got the 7th. The 7th medal had been in the Museum of Logistics Supplies, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And when he had first called, the curator there said, well, you can't have it. It's on display up here. Well, we know it's on display up there. That's why we're calling you to try to get the damn thing, all right? You know? And so at that point, our curator, brilliant, did an end run. He found out that the man's daughter had risen to the rank of a colonel in logistics in the Army. She had followed her father. So he called the daughter and said to the daughter, we would love to be able to display his medal with the other 6, but your museum won't give it up. The commander of logistics then called his museum curator and said, that medal had better be down there within a week. Surprise. And when I went in, that's the first thing I saw was these 7 medals of honor. And I thought, my God, how they were able to do that. That's the kind of miracles. When you're on the inside, that's miraculous to you, how that kind of thing happens as a historian. You've done a lot of research abroad and discovered new documents all over Europe and so on. But it's a different thing when you see something you've thought about in your head and conceptualized in your head actually appear before you and in a beautifully done exhibit. Well, that exhibit did well here and traveled around successfully. And then, and I don't know any of the inside of this, I'm absolutely innocent. But I was informed a while back that the museum had received $1.5 million to do a new exhibit. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to know how they got it. I figured some company gave the money up willingly. Nobody was hurt in the process. And so we reconvened again, but this time was a much larger group of outside historical advisors, and then a larger group within the museum, including Cory, who was curator, and Krewasky, who was the external curator brought in. And I'm thinking, what a change. The other thing that had changed was that I was flat on my back because I had spine surgery a few months ago. I am now the bionic man. This is twice in 10 years. My father's World War II generation, his bent him over. He refused to have the surgery because every one of his buddies who did it ended up in a wheelchair immediately. And he looked at me and he said, "Not for me." I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to walk around with a damn cane, and I'll end up in a wheelchair." And he did at age 87. And I thought, hey, man, you staved that off for about 25 years. Well, I'm a miracle of modern medicine. I will not do any flips or turns for you, but I'm up here standing erect because of that, and I'm back at the museum, and I'm thankful to be back here. My wife was a little concerned. She's always concerned when I come down to the museum, which I've been doing for 20 years. She says, "Are you coming back?" I said, "Of course, my dear. I love you more than anything else. But the museum is a distant second." All right? So I will go back after this, but it's a real pleasure to be back. Now let me turn it over to the fellows who do the hard work in this business, to our curators, our two curators here, Cory and Krewasky. This is going to be exciting even for me. Thank you.
Well, let me take over first. I'm Cory Graff, one of the curators here at the National World War II Museum. Both Dr. Salter and I decided we would actually not present from the podium. We'd present from our seats. We want to be close to our computers and free water. We can't be far away from our free water either. So it's my job to tell you a little bit about how this came about. Fighting for the right to fight dates back in museum terms for quite a while. To 2015, there was a much smaller version of the exhibit here in the Louisiana Pavilion. It was about 1,700 square feet, almost entirely dealt with military men, African Americans, during World War II, and was divided up by branch. So there was a section on the Marines and Navy and Army Air Forces and so on. It was extremely popular. It had a run here and then went to 12 different venues across the United States and was the exhibit that everyone asked for and everyone wanted. So it wasn't absolutely surprising that we were going to do bigger and better. Dr. Morrow was talking about being the bionic man. You know, we're going to make it better, faster, stronger, that sort of thing. So it was this group's job to develop that new exhibit, which had its bones in the old exhibit. Certainly, you're still going to be talking about African Americans in World War II. But the new venue, almost 3 times as big, of 4,000 square feet, give or take, allowed you to do a lot of different things, and it allowed you to explore a lot of themes in more detail than you were seeing in the original version of the exhibit. And one of the things that I'll say about it, just in a general sense, I'll let Dr. Salter talk a lot about the content, but the whole idea of if you've got 1.2 African American men and women in uniform, and many of them overseas during World War II, and this new expanded footprint and this new expanded story was going to make it so that we were going to be able to pull in more discussions of civilians, more discussions of the home front, more discussion of women, both in uniform and in industry during the war. And when you step back and you think about those 1.2 in uniform, and no one's even really sure how many people we're talking about in industry, a lot of the government sources will quote that about 1 million people moved from their homes to the industries, which are primarily on the West Coast and up in the Rust Belt and on the East Coast as well. It's an amazing Swiss Army knife of things to talk about. So one of the primary jobs of a curator is to boil that down We all know that a flighty curator who can talk about X or Y for way too long, and you want to sort of slink away. And we want to be able to tell this story, this massive story, in a coherent way. Now, there are certain things that separate a museum exhibit from what you're going to see when you crack open a book. A couple of those are what we'd call AV or media, films, etc. I'll talk about those. And in addition, it's artifacts. It's being able to actually put that thing in front of someone's nose and have them marvel. And we try to pick things that obviously tell a broader story as we go through. So Fighting for the Right to Fight has about 100 artifacts, give or take. And many of them were difficult for us. And what I mean by that, the World War II Museum's doctrine, obviously, is to focus on World War II era material. And this exhibit was going to be expansive. It was going to talk about African American society in America well before World War II and go up through the civil rights movement, etc. So one of the first things that we were doing is diving into the auction houses and calling in favors and making connections and locating material that goes back to 1899 type ballot box and up through 1963 civil rights pennant. Those are things that you'll see in the exhibit. And as you might imagine, when the collecting doctrine is stuff from, the early 30s up to 1945 or 1946 or 47 or wherever you want to draw the line, it's a little outside of our comfort zone. So I'm quite proud of that. Now, the other thing that happened from the old exhibit to the new exhibit is we had located areas in which we wanted to bolster, if you will. Material that had demonstrated sort of racism and the disposition of American society before World War II was quite small in the early exhibit, but critical to our story. Things like Port Chicago, we'd tried and struggled to locate materials from Port Chicago, which is the naval explosion at the armament facility in the Bay Area in California. Material about Tuskegee Airmen. We didn't have a lot within our collection. We had some, but not very much. One thing I should say is African American collections are quite rare. We're all used to this celebration of these white soldiers that came home, and Tom Brokaw is calling them the greatest generation and so on. There's a lot of sons and daughters of these people that revere them and keep these uniforms and photo albums. And what you see with African Americans, which is a big part of our story, is sort of that disappointment of putting their rear on the line, giving almost everything and sometimes everything for their country, and coming back to an America that didn't appreciate them the way that they wanted, which means that stuff gets tossed. So it's quite rare to find material to African Americans. In a general sense, the museum holds 270,000 items that are cataloged, and probably many, many additional ones. And I'm just going to throw out a number because I don't really know, but there may be 36 collections that have to do with African Americans in World War II. So it was very important to leverage those in a very serious manner because they were so rare. And the other thing you have to do is formulate partnerships. You have to talk to families, find those people that had dad or granddad or grandma in the service. And we were very, very successful with that. When you go see the exhibit, you'll see the hood from a Ku Klux Klansman from the 1920s. And we were able to talk with the University of West Florida about what it would take to exhibit that piece of hateful material in a different context and in a different way. Port Chicago material, we were able to talk to a museum in Viejo, California, and secure Freddie Meeks' collection. Freddie Meeks was not there the day of the explosion in July of 1944 that killed 320 sailors, many of them African American. But he was one of the 50 that protested, that didn't go back to work because of the unsafe conditions. And he, like the other 49, were sentenced to prison sentences. His was 18 months. And then he was court-martialed. And it took up until the 1990s for him to be pardoned. So the idea of having his jumper and his hymnal in the exhibit goes well beyond just a jumper and a hymnal. It goes to tell you this type of story about how African Americans were treated during and after the war. Also, there's a fragment within the exhibit. It's actually the butt end of a 5-inch shell from like a destroyer that was thrown 13 miles to downtown Viejo and picked up off the street and donated to a museum. When it came to Tuskegee Airmen, we were able to secure a collection of material from Claiborne Buddy Lockett, who was a flyer from the Los Angeles area. He joined the 332nd Fighter Group, flew in Italy, and interestingly enough was loaned to the Royal Air Force and flew in North Africa and Italy with the British as well. So his logbook has things like the Spitfire, the Hurricane, captured airplanes like Ju-87 and Ju-88. Some of his material, if you're a skillful observer, is Royal Air Force material. His gauntlet gloves are in the collection. Many U.S. aviators preferred Royal Air Force flying material, especially boots, gloves, receivers, things like that, because they just viewed them as better. The gauntlet gloves go up to about here, which really helps you in case of a fire. We were also able to talk to Janice Martin, whose mother, Indiana Hunt, married name Indiana Hunt Martin, was with the 6888 in Europe during the war, and she had a great comment. She said, "I teased my mother for years about carrying around this suitcase full of junk. And now here it all is in the museum. Her blouse, her combat boots, a box that was made by a POW, and some other material is within the exhibit and really brings that story to life. The largest artifact in the exhibit is I know this by heart, a 285-pound balloon winch, barrage balloon winch, of the type that was used on D-Day by the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The first African Americans to come to shore, they had balloons in the air by about 11:20 on June 6th. So there's some really amazing material in there. And then second to that artifact collection is a wonderful collection of ways for people to access material in a digital sense. And what I mean by that is you experience when someone goes into an exhibit and you secretly trail them around, they call them skimmers, swimmers, and divers. You'll have those people that will roll through and they'll just pull out the intros and other things like that. There's your moderates who will do some swimming, and then there's your divers who are going to read every comma and period in an exhibit. They're the ones you go with, and when you want to go home, they're like on panel number 2, and you're like staring at the ceiling. And interestingly enough, when you take your friends and family, if you're a curator, when you take your friends and family, they feel like it's very respectful to read everything. I mean, it's what you've invested all your time and energy into. And you've been working on this exhibit for 9 months. You know every comma and every period, and you're like, come on, let's go. So we tried to design our AV for that purpose. And what I mean by that is your skimmers can read your introductions, and also we've created 3 5-minute bespoke movies, if you will, within the exhibit. And if you watch those movies, you invest your 15 minutes, 5 minutes apiece, you're going to get a lot of the basic beats. On the other end of the spectrum is the divers who want everything. And as I talked about in this discussion, when you're talking about millions of people, there's many, many units, many, many notable people, many, many amazing locations. So we came up with this idea, and there's 2 of them within the exhibit called Victory in Every Theater, which shows that these African Americans, these Americans, went all over the world during World War II. So via pins in a world map, you can look at the CBI, or you can look at the home front, or you can look at the Pacific, and so on, Europe, Mediterranean, etc. And you can see a lot of the famous places, a lot of the famous units, a lot of the famous people. Not necessarily all famous people as well. One of the things that we wanted to do is leverage our best collections, photo collections, and donated collections, and tell the story of some people you've never heard of, Ed Brown or Ethel Simpson, who experienced the war. We have a lot of their material, and this was a perfect opportunity to put that material into an interactive. Those pins could go on forever. There's certainly suggestions about, like, you missed this person, you'd like to put this person in, etc. The other difficulty we had is when you're trying to put a pin on where the USS Mason is during World War II. Of course, it's out roaming the Pacific, or talking about the messmen on the San Francisco. It was everywhere in the Pacific during the war, so you have to pick a place that's somewhat logical, but they're all over the place. Or you have someone like Ed Brown, who starts in the Persian Gulf and ends up in the CBI with the same engineering unit. So there's certain things that you have to do to make it concrete. And finally is StoryFile, which you've probably experienced here before. It's sort of a revolutionary and very interesting technology in which you can have a virtual conversation with a veteran. I think we've captured 18, 19, 20, something so far. And the African Americans, Theodore Britton, George Hardy, and Romay Davis are on display in 2 stations within this exhibit. And you can press a button and ask them where they were at Pearl Harbor, and they'll tell you where they were. Now, peeking behind the curtain, these necessitate the veteran to come to Los Angeles to a special studio and be subjected to approximately 3 days of questions in which they answer everything from what their favorite color is to where they were during Pearl Harbor, from what they did during the war, etc. So it's a very, very revolutionary and interesting thing to talk about. Now, Fighting for the Right to Fight will be on display at the National World War II Museum until July of 2025. And this is where it gets exciting for us. It's actually going to travel on the road. As you go through and you look at the exhibit, I want you to imagine everything in that room folding down into 2 tractor trailers going across the country. This was also one of the reasons that the exhibit is so large comparatively compared to the last one. Is one of the things that we wanted to do is get as many eyes on this exhibit as possible. And that means New York and Chicago and LA and San Francisco and these bigger venues that have more visitorship. So all in all, it was an amazing experience. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Salter, who's going to talk a little bit about developing the content.
Okay, well, John. Okay, so hard acts to follow, John Morrow and Cory. So the first thing I want to do is thank the National World War II Museum for inviting me to be the guest curator and subject matter expert for the reimagination of this exhibition. And as Cory mentioned, you come in and you're the guest curator, you work with a team of people, so it was certainly a collaborative event. So there were 5 core members, myself, Cory, Pete Crane, Aaron Clancy, and Nina Lockman was our project manager. And of course, Stephen was in several of the meetings. And then from the Institute, Mike Bell and several of his people would also come into some of the meetings and look at the content and talk to us about what it is that we plan to focus on. And John mentioned scholarly advisors. I've had the pleasure of curating 4 national level exhibitions, this being the 4th one. And I have never done an exhibition at this level without scholarly advisors. So John Morrow, Adrian Lewis, Tracy Parker, who cannot be here tonight, Marcus Clark, and Marcus Cox, and Greg Cook. Those individuals, your job as a curator is you put something forward, but you need to listen to everyone and try to make sure that we are capturing just about everything we can. And as Cory said, you have this big duffel bag, but how do you scale it down into something that makes sense to the visitors when they come and see the exhibition? So in every meeting, I took copious notes and listened to those individuals. But the first thing I did was once I was invited to be on board and we got the contract started, is like anyone else, I started making a sketch. Not quite a napkin, it's not that romantic. I put a sketch on a piece of paper and I would take it around with me. And I still have 3 or 4 of those sketches. And then I began to put it into a PowerPoint. So when I came to the first meeting, after being told that we want to reimagine the first exhibition, it was our most popular traveling exhibition. That puts pressure on you right away. We want to make it, as Cory said, bigger, better, stronger. It's 3 times the size. And my first question was, well, do I have the flexibility to think outside of the box and give you a lot of ideas? And the answer was absolutely. So with that, I think we'll go to the first slide. And so again, this is not the intent for you to read the slides. What I want to do is I tried to develop this for the in-house audience and the folks at home to whet your appetite. And I'm going to do the skimmer. I have about 12 slides. I'm going to go through those really quick, but only 5 of those slides are the slides that people who are skimmers. This is the introduction slide. I will read and footnote and paraphrase from those slides, and then the 4 section slides. But we're not going to start with this slide. We're going to go to my napkin drawing. So this is the only slide I presented to my next slide. Oh, I got the advancer. So this is what I presented to my client. I said, okay, well, if this is about fighting for the right to fight and African Americans fighting for a double victory during World War II, and as Cory said, this was the meat and potatoes of your exhibition, I feel that in order for us to have visitors understand why were African Americans fighting for the right to fight and for a double victory as late as 1941, for a double victory. Victory abroad, they were willing to fight for, but victory at home. So one of the ideas I put forward, and I think we'll see that came to fruition, is we expanded this section to have people understand what life was like for African Americans before the war. you have to really put yourself in the African American shoe and understand what life was about. And we talked about advances and setbacks, their military prowess, their ups and downs. And then we can flow into World War II. And these are just some of the ideas of images. So also as the curator, is your mission to put forward the images that you would like to use, to make a artifact list. So Cory, he talked about the artifacts. And so I put together what we call wish lists. And I also want to thank the World War II Museum for going outside of their box, because museums have a collection plan, and their collection plan is World War II. We went outside of that box. And also after World War II, and you fight for this double victory, but only one victory is won overseas, then you go to the post-war and you talk about the civil rights movement. And one of the things we talked about is, okay, let's put more stories on the home front: progress, setback, personalities. You'll see those when you go over. And then every single theater of war. I wanted to make sure that we talked about African Americans being out there as early as 1942. And with that team of individuals, we got tons of ideas of how to put this story together. And so that was my napkin sketch. And I think we did a pretty good job. So this is the skimmer slide. So I'm going to read and footnote what this actually says. And I can barely see on my, I can't see any of you. So with the lights. So basically, what we have here is African Americans have participated in every war in U.S. history, frequently earning distinctions as individuals and as units. During World War II, more than 1.2 million African American men and women served in all branches of the U.S. military in every theater of war. They served in the Army, the Navy, the Air Corps, the Marines, the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marines. Women served as WACs. African American women served as WACs, spars, and waves. The only service they didn't serve in was the Marines, and the Marines are very proud of never having an acronym. They were just women Marines. So they served in every theater of operation. I think we captured that. They also fought political and social battles on the home front, petitioning for their right to work in the defense industry and the wartime industrial population. World War II had special meanings for African Americans because they were fighting for democracy overseas and freedom overseas, and they were also fighting for civil rights at home. From the Tuskegee Airmen fighting segregation while also fighting in the air, Black Rosetta Riveters who entered the workforce as men went overseas, African Americans paved the way for social and political justice. That is one of the 5 of the skimmer slides. So when you go over to the exhibition this evening, or if you have been or you go tomorrow, and those of you who may come visit, this is the slide that pretty much sets the stage. So the next 4 slides are just build slides to whet your appetite. As a curator as well, one of the things that you want to do is educate, inspire. At least that's the way I was brought up in the museum arena. Number 1, you want an exhibition to educate people as best as it can. As Cory said, it's not a book on a wall, but you want them to be inspired by that little piece of what they read, and then maybe go pick up a book, or go pick up an article, or go to the archives. Now they are inspired to learn more about that one piece of subject matter. And so let's go to the second of 5 of the skimmer slides. So there are 3 chapters in the exhibition, as you saw from our sketch. Chapter 2 has an A and a B. And we also come up with ideas as we're talking about having even the color of the sections being different. Should there be a design in the exhibition, something that connotes that double V, so people can see that actually when they go through the exhibition? So you're going to see a color change, and they go from dark to light. So when you get to chapter 1, we already talked about chapter 1. And chapter 1 is the pre-war section. Okay, so the lights have ruined my plan to read this, so I'm going to tell you exactly what this says. So basically, it talks about setbacks and progresses. So it says, African Americans have participated in every war in American history, thus leading to victory in the Civil War and gaining 3 amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865, which freed those who were in bondage. The 14th Amendment in 1868, which gave them citizenship. And the 15th Amendment in 1870, which gave African American men the right to vote. They also created family units. They also created businesses. They also participated in uplifting cultural events such as the Harlem Renaissance. They also served on the Western frontier and did a host of things that made them American citizens. But at the same time, there were forces that were pulling African Americans back. So you have the Supreme Court cases of 1883 before Plessy versus Ferguson. You have the Compromise of 1876, which pulls troops out of the South and leads to President Rutherford B. Hayes going into the presidency. So when you read this, you see progresses and setbacks. And so just the bill slide, I'm not going to read this to you, but I want to give those folks who won't have an idea to go visit the exhibition. So we do talk about the legacy of military service, so folks understand that World War II was not the African American first rodeo in wars. They had been prior to the American Revolution, the War of 1812. Well, that's the American Revolution, that's prior. The War of 1812, the American Civil War, the Western frontier. Those progresses that led to them being American citizens. But at the same time, this is what African Americans were dealing with. This is a flag that the NAACP made in the 1920s, and it hung over in the 1930s, a downtown New York City building, and that's what the flag said. It was to create the environment and to know that African Americans, when someone was lynched the day before, this is a National Archives slide which shows in every continental state, with the exception of 5, between 1890 and 1921, more than 3,400 African Americans were lynched, and it has the number. This is an artifact case. I put on the wish list. The first exhibition had a membership card. On the wish list, I had KKK regalia. And when Cory sent me the email and said, we found one at the University of West Florida, because you also want people to be impacted when they read the story. A museum is a safe place. It's an institution where you should be able to go and learn about what people experience. And then Tulsa, Oklahoma was just one of many stories where we could have talked about African Americans and their towns and cities being destroyed. And so skimming along to chapter 2, what this pretty much says is that African American women went into the workforce, African American men were also going into the workforce, and it also talks about the fact that African Americans were at the grassroots level. And so as you build this slide and you go over to the exhibition, you're going to see the story of the Rosita Riveters. They were in the first exhibition and Executive Order 8802, but we expanded that story. These are artifacts that you will see that Cory talked about some of those. And in this same section 2, explaining what double victory really was. Before you go into the war, this is what double victory means. And then it also talks about serving at home. So not all American soldiers went overseas. So we expanded that story as well. Okay. And then chapter 2, overseas, We talk about it is impossible to create a dual personality, and we'll talk about that during Q&A. I don't believe the 6888 was in the first exhibition. We made sure they were, and the nurses, and the Merchant Marines. And this is my favorite story in African American history at this point. We may talk about that during Q&A, and coming home. And so I'll wrap it up there so we can get to some more Q&A. But bottom line is that the African American experience contributed to victory during World War II. We wanted to make sure we highlighted that and also talk about those veterans who come home and serve, participate in the civil rights movement.
Very good.
We probably should open it up to them because of
Questions?
Yes, so if you have questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring the microphones to you. We're going to start in the center aisle, about halfway back, gentlemen.
Right, thank you. Hello, my name is Kel Carter. I am Director of Exhibitions at the Buffalo Soldiers Museum. And I had a question, well, it's kind of something that I've been experiencing even with exhibitions we do ourselves, that when we do anything covering subject matter like this, one of the things we hear from young people is, okay, how is this relevant to us today? And so because of that, we had to try to shift to try to cover that. My question is, with this exhibition, I know it stops at the civil rights movement. Given that the legacy of World War II still impacts us today, are y'all going to include that in kind of a future update of the exhibition, or like what kind of basically make ties to it or something like that? That's my only question.
Okay, so what's the question, that it doesn't end in the civil rights movement? Do we continue forward? Yes, okay. And you're at the Buffalo Soldier Museum in Houston, Texas? Is that okay? Great. Well, I've been there a couple of times, spoken in the past there, I think twice. Well, you know, of course, when you're kind of the last speaker, and I chose to be last, my time got wrapped up pretty quickly. And so the last slide covers that. So this exhibition does not end with the civil rights movement. And we also make sure that we say in the exhibition, number one, a lot of people put bookends on the civil rights movement, 1954 to 1968. We made a conscious effort, and a lot of us know that the civil rights movement just doesn't spark with Brown versus the Board of Education, Emmett Till, and Martin Luther King coming on the scene. So we say the modern day civil rights movement because, in my opinion, the seed was actually planted deep by the World War I veterans, and that is interpreted in this exhibition. This exhibition goes up to present day in the fact that we actually say there is still work to be done. I believe that's in the video, the video piece, because everything cannot be put in the text. So you're exactly right. This exhibition does not end in 1963 or 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King. We're still saying that there is progress, but there is still work to be done. So I think when you go through the exhibition, you'll see that.
I would also note, to add to that, I happened to be going through the museum this morning, and who should be in the African American exhibit but curator Cory Graff taking a group of high school students through the exhibit. And both black and white students, and I'm laughing and thinking to myself, passing on the knowledge. And being older than either of these two young gentlemen, having been in that exhibit, and I got to one of the photos, and it has the 6888 Postal Battalion of women marching through France, a city in France, and the date is May 27th, 1945. And I thought, hey, I was born May 27th, 1944. And so that situated me. I thought, I'm 1 year old, and here these ladies are marching. I also date D-Day. I was responsible for D-Day too, because I was born a few weeks before that. But the main thing is that if you're as old as I am, I had an uncle who was a lieutenant in the Army in Italy, fighting in Italy. I had another uncle who was an Army major who didn't deploy but was at Fort Belvoir the entire war. But the greatest shock to me, among other members of the family, was a fellow who was my cousin on my mother's side, whom I knew as a New York City bureaucrat who seemed a mild-mannered character. And then his mother and father showed me this little photograph that he had sent them in World War II, and it shows him in gear marching along this sandy beach, and it says, going from Iwo Jima to ? And he had never said anything, but he had been a Montford Point Marine. And that's when you realize these things came out incidentally. The only person who ever gave me anything to give to my son, who was in Special Forces in Iraq, was my wife's father, my father-in-law, who had been a decorated regimental surgeon in Italy in World War II. And he gave our son his medals and his gear. So that was very nice.
Another question all the way to your right towards the front.
Since we had the section you showed about the barrage balloons at D-Day, I would assume that you would be able to comment on Waverly Woodson Jr., who was such a key component there and certainly perhaps didn't get all the recognition at that time that he honestly deserved. So if you could speak to that, it'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. So Waverly Woodson was a medic in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. So for those of you, I know in this room a lot of people know, but you know, that picture, the reason that's very important to me is I knew of that picture about 10 or 15 years before I knew who was on the other end of those balloons. That is one of the most popular World War II images. And on the other side of those balloons is the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, about 600 plus soldiers, and they also have medics. Waverly Woodson was a medic who went ashore, the 29th Division and the 1st Division, as you know, Omaha and Utah Beach. Waverly Woodson, I won't go through the whole story, but a traumatic experience like all soldiers getting to the beach, was wounded as a medic. He is credited with treating over 200 soldiers while he was wounded. Then he finally collapses more than a day afterwards. And, you know, like most African Americans, and we won't go into a detail here, but we know about their experiences coming home. And he's one of the many that says, you know, decades later, no one asked. And there is evidence that he was put in for a possible Medal of Honor, just written on a paper. It never completely got up to the higher echelons. Just recently, he was looked at, and they actually awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross. But of course, some folks are still pushing for the fact that perhaps he should be a Medal of Honor recipient. And so that's the truncated story of Waverly Woodson. And he's in the film, and I think he's also in the interactive. He's not on the panels in the exhibition.
Very good. Next question is going to be to your left with Connie, please.
Question for Cory, and then a question for Dr. Morrow and Dr. Salter. Cory, for those of us who are not curators, I would imagine you must have a heart attack packing up everything into 2 trucks and waving goodbye. Can you tell us about the nuts and bolts of how that occurs, and how do you make sure everything's taken care of, and insurance for this, et cetera? And then for Dr. Morrow and Dr. Salter, can you give us maybe your favorite Medal of Honor story among the 7 recipients?
Well, there's a wonderful thing about a large institution like this that I've got to put a caveat on my answer, and that is that there's not only the curatorial, but there's the exhibits department, who is responsible for that magic, for that trip, that magic trick of getting everything to fit. Now, In addition to that, the collections department has a lot to say about how these items we traveled to, particularly, not necessarily the hardware, not the die bond and the metal structures and the Sintra and even the TVs, but all of these materials that are, in essence, irreplaceable, and how they travel as well. So usually what you do in a very general sense is you have art handlers do this traveling. So the items will be packed up mostly by our exhibits department. You get sort of sucked in as a curator because it's your big project and you're working on it. And certainly I was down there working on the install, even though the exhibits folks are supposed to do it. And on the way out, I'll probably be somewhat involved as well. So it's a little bit, because of its value and because of its, the time-sensitive nature of having it in Memphis on a certain day, or it screws up the whole schedule, you usually have it traveled and insured via, like a large, expensive piece of art. It's a very large piece of art.
I have a hard time choosing. It has to be, for me, I'll pick between Vernon Baker and Edward Carter. I'll pick Baker alphabetically, although Carter has even a more fascinating story. Vernon Baker was in the 92nd Division. That's the division my father-in-law served in, and my uncle. And he was a lieutenant. He's not, the interesting thing about these World War II men is that they're not large or big. I get really annoyed when I see war movies and they depict these men, even today, as large, bulky, and so on and so forth, sort of like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And you're thinking, they don't look like that. In fact, I was talking to an older colonel one day, and I said, that bugs me. He said, yeah, most of the guys I know who are really good look more like Pee Wee Herman than Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so it stuck with me vividly that when Bill Clinton awarded Vernon Baker his Medal of Honor in 1997, he towers over Baker. And my uncle, who was infantry officer, was like 5'7" or 5'8", normal size for that time. And Baker had already been wounded, literally in a gunfight, and this sounds like the Wild West, but in a gunfight with a German officer who had a Schmeisser, and he had his Tommy gun, and they shot each other. Turned out Baker was the more accurate shot, killed the German officer, but he got knocked down and wounded, and he comes back a little later on. And this is when his unit is trying to take the peak at Somnicollia in Italy, and his captain, his white captain, was really very reluctant. He's got a company of men to take his men up the hill. And he said, well, I'll stay down at the foot with the company. And Baker says, well, I'll take 5 men and scout the hill. So he takes 5 men with him. They go up the hill in successive gunfights with the Germans who appear out of the hill. He kills about 7 or 8 of them because he's faster and he's more accurate. He rolls grenades into some of these other little dugouts that the Germans have, and he and his 5 men, he loses about 2 of them, take the summit of the hill. And then he says to one of the men, go back down and tell the captain to bring the company up. At which point the captain brings the company up, and Baker is awarded a Distinguished Service Cross, and no African Americans were awarded Medals of Honor until after the war in '97. He was actually asked to speak at a number of engagements post-war. One of the more humiliating experiences of his was that he wore the ribbon for the Distinguished Service Cross on his uniform, and one day in Germany, and he's still in the Army, this white colonel comes by, says, "Boy, where did you get that ribbon?" And before Baker can say anything, he said, "Take that thing off and don't you ever wear it again." Well, Colonel, he remembered that. He's actually in the collection of people talking here at the museum. And later, when he receives his Medal of Honor, he just says, regretfully, "I wish the other fellows could have lived long enough to receive theirs." But it's really quite a poignant comment, but he had managed to survive that long. But Krewasky can take Carter if he wants, but these are men whose bravery is equal to any man, anywhere, anytime. And they should have received those medals.
I know we're over time, but I'm going to go ahead and there's not a favorite. And actually, as John was talking, I was just thinking of truncating two, Reuben Rivers and John Fox, because these are men who knew as they were doing their deed that they were not going to survive the war, at least one for sure. John Fox, and Reuben Rivers had been wounded so critically that I'm sure he knew he was going to die. But Reuben Rivers was in the 761st Tank Battalion, which got into Europe in late October, went into action of 44, went into action in November of 44. And it was actually last Saturday was the anniversary. We just happened to realize that. And so he was wounded in an action when their tanks was spearheading an attack. And his commander actually asked him to pull back. He refused medical attention. He continued on for the next day or so, and he was killed in action while still fighting in his tank. That's the very truncated version. You can read more about it in the exhibition. And then John Fox absolutely knew that he was going to perish in his act. He was in the 92nd Division in one of the field artillery units, and his unit was in a town. They had went down into kind of a valley area, and they were just surrounded by hundreds of Germans. And, Ford observers, and there are some in this room I know, you know where a target is, you know where an individual is, and when an individual says, "Hey," had a voice like John, he said, "Fire it." And they hesitated because they knew that he was firing on his own position. And so those two. And we can talk about Watson and Thomas and all the others, but just like any Medal of Honor recipient or any American soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine who goes to war and are willing to give their lives, it's something to behold. But for this exhibition, what we interpret is these 7 individuals were not awarded their Medals of Honor until 1997. Until 1997. And not really a part of this exhibition. The last Medal of Honor that was awarded to an African American in war was during the Spanish-American War in 1898. And then the next time an African American was awarded the Medal of Honor were 2 African Americans in the Korean War, Thomas and Cornelius Charlton, who I had the honor to collect his Medal of Honor for the Smithsonian from his brother in Hawaii several years ago. And so that speaks to separate but equal. And I'm writing a piece for another organization right now, and I'll just kind of give you a heads up. Separate but equal was so powerful that it impacted the way we awarded our highest military medal. Because think about it. 1898 is 2 years after Plessy versus Ferguson. 1952 is 2 years from Brown versus the Board of Education. So on both ends, Plessy versus Ferguson was just setting in. Brown versus the Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement was just arising. So the two Medal of Honors from World War I, people were saying, well, no, there were two African Americans awarded the Medal of Honor in World War I. Well, those two individuals were not awarded their Medals of Honor until 1992 and 2015. And then, of course, the World War II in 1997. So those are the stories we tell, too. How can we make sure that we reach back and look? I do have a personal story about Baker, but I can tell that to people later on. That happened to me on a research trip about 7 years ago. So I'll end there in the interest of time.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a wonderful discussion about a wonderful exhibition. Thanks to all of those. Before you all leave, I've got some important information so you don't have to run around asking, well, where was I supposed to go, Jeremy? Before you all leave, take everything with you. We will be cleaning up the ballroom. We will have our 3 speakers outside in the retail area for signing. We have our museum open house and reception right now. The reception will be in the Louisiana Memorial Pavilion. It's beginning at 5:36. 5:30. We'll run through 7:30. All of the campus is open except for the stage door canteen. This includes the Kushner Restoration Pavilion, so you all can go in and take a look at our PT 305 and the new deck. For those of you going to the Frog Father's dinner and the screening, that's in stage door canteen. Doors will open at 6:15. Dinner will be served at 6:30. And for everyone, tomorrow breakfast at 6:30 a.m. and the first session is at 9. Thank you for a wonderful day.